All right, in this chapter, we are going to get started here talking about the foundations of world history. And we are going to deviate a little bit from the book because I want us to get a foundation and understanding of why we study history in the first place. Because a lot of people walk into history class or into a survey of ancient civilizations and they don't know why we need to study all this stuff. And the question's often asked, what's the point of history? Why do we need to study it? Why do we need to memorize all these people and understand why they did all these things that don't really matter today? The truth is, it does matter today, and it has relevance in us understanding who we are, where we've come from, and how we can better relate to other cultures and other people, as well as understanding our own. And it also helps us to have a greater appreciation for all the people that have sacrificed and have lived and have accomplished things to help inspire us to be able to do so much more. And so we're going to highlight a number of things here as well as study about what historians do. And so I want to lay the foundation of that here. I've got a couple of videos that are going to show up in the slides here that I can't show you here on these slides, but if you want to see those videos, I'll try to also put the link in the online resources for you in the class page. So we begin here looking at the study of world history, and studying world history does have a lot of value. And I'd encourage you to write in several things in addition to what you see pop up on the screen. So if you need to at any point, stop and pause the video as you are writing notes and taking down some of these thoughts. Write them in your own words so that they make sense to you. Don't worry about copying mine word for word. Most of these are not going to have a strict definition to them. I'm not going to ask you to write the definition, but I do want you to understand what the topics mean and that you could explain them to somebody else. So we need to understand that studying history has incredible value to it. We need to know and define what history is before we even can understand what we're trying to value here. And so when we look at the term history, it literally means inquiry. And so we should be asking questions. We should be wondering, why did somebody go off and fight a battle? Why did this king pass this law? Or what was happening that led to this decision that was being made? And so there's all kinds of questions that are being asked because there's a lot of parts of history that we don't know. Or maybe we could find the answer if we dug a little bit deeper. And so we need to continue to question. And we're trying to question what and why. And so we want to dive into those questions. What's going on and why did it happen? And I think perhaps the why question is the most important of all of the questions. We're trying to find out who was involved, what were they doing, where was this happening, but why did it all come together in the way that it does? And why did people make the decisions that they make? And if we truly understand why, then it might help us to make better decisions in our own life, or perhaps to avoid certain situations that did not turn out so well for people of history. And so inquiring is a good thing. Asking the why, trying to investigate the why. And so we need to ask that question here first. Why do we study history? History is boring. History is bland. Well, it doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't be. And I hope that as I present it to you, that you can see that it's not boring. It's not bland. There's a lot for us to be able to study that's fun and exciting and interesting. And perhaps if what I'm talking about doesn't interest you, you can bring up and ask a question that will help us pursue something that you are interested in. But history helps prepare us for the future. By understanding the past, we can make better decisions for the future, and it understands our place in the world. And so that way we can understand why we interact with certain countries the way that we do, or why certain things are built the way that they are, or why countries make decisions that they make. It also helps give us a cultural identity. To understand more about where we've come from, we need to understand those that lived before us and the situations that they went through. It also helps us to declare God's glory. If we understand how God has worked through the lives of these people or in each of these situations, we can then learn to appreciate more about God's sovereignty and the way that God works in and through people. Another video here that I can't show you on this, but you can take a look at that in the Canvas page a little bit later. And so it's important that we look at the historian and his task. So the historian needs to be able to take several resources, put them together, and in order for us to understand that, we need to know what type of resources we are dealing with. The first of which are primary resources. Now, primary resources are those that are created during the time in which the event was happening or in which a person is able to observe those with his own eyes. These resources are not something that are created after the fact. So primary, we'll come back, we'll talk more about those a little bit later as well. There's also secondary resources. Now, secondary resources are those that explain or interpret the actual event or that explain those primary resources. And so a secondary resource would be an example that would be a textbook that is telling you what is said in the Constitution. The primary resource for that would be the Constitution itself, but the secondary resource would be any sort of explanation. And there are lots of different secondary resources. It could be an individual like myself who's explaining to you certain events. It could be a book. It could be a YouTube video. All of those would be secondary resources. Now, when we talk about primary resources, there are three basic primary sources that we often refer to. The first one are artifacts. Artifacts are any sort of tangible item that we can observe and learn about culture, learn about history, learn about people. And so paintings, architecture, relics, any of those things are a primary resource. And many of those things we learn by interpreting and evaluating what's observed. It doesn't necessarily speak to us, or a lot of times there's not stuff written on there that explains to us what it means, and so we have to do some interpretation there. There's tradition. Tradition are things that are generally passed along from one generation to the next. Many times it is through verbal communication, through stories, through legends. These tend to be the least reliable, but do tend to give us some sort of sense of culture and people. Now, the most reliable and the most important are the written records. I can't stress this enough, but written records are the best ones. If we can get our hands on that primary resource, that's one we want to go to because it is going to be the most accurate. So how do we use those resources when we do find either primary or secondary resources? First of all, we need to evaluate. It's so critical that we compare to other sources. You can't just use one single source and assume that that is going to be full truth. You need to compare to other things around it. Then you need to synthesize. So evaluation to me is collecting as much data as you possibly can. Synthesis is where we're going to take that information and you're going to pour all that information together into a pot. And you're going to stir it around a little bit. You're going to try to find out what is in common, what goes together, what doesn't. And as you stir that together, you're going to start to get a sense of how it all comes together and how it all works as telling one story. And then you're going to do some interpretation. That's where you're going to explain what happened. That's where you take all those ingredients from the pot and you dip a spoon down in there and you pull it out and you taste it and you have a good sense of what you have created with your evaluation, your synthesis. And you're going to make an attempt to explain what is in that pot and how it got there. And that will help us to be able to formulate a story based off the evidence that we have. Now, it's not always 100% accurate, but that's why we need to go to the closest primary source and we need to be able to compare it to other primary sources to get the best sense of what happened in history and how it's significant to people today. So we use those resources. In class, I use a couple different examples. I think sometimes I've used an old receipt to help us to evaluate and to synthesize some information. I've also used this example here from two Olympians that they had an incredible testimony that they shared on a national platform, national stage. And so I'll show a video clip of these two guys in the interview that they had, and I'll ask these questions here as you evaluate, synthesize, and interpret what was going on in that entire video clip. And so it should be posted in Canvas as well. You can see that video clip and go through the questions and evaluate that primary source for you as well. There's a link to that video, and once again, here are those questions. So pause the video and check that out and see if you get an opportunity to do that.